I'm Richard Dowden. I'm director of the Royal African Society, and I've been a journalist working on Africa for quite a long time. My memory of, one of my burning memories of Kenya was in 1991, when I went there to make a film for Channel 4 on the meeting that very few people knew about, which was a meeting to demand multi-party democracy. Very scary concept in those days, and it was held in the Kamakunji field where Jomo Kenyatta used to give his great speeches against colonialism. So it was a very symbolic place, and it was held on the 7th of July 1991 and is known ever since as Saba Saba. My crew and I were welcomed by all the people there, and for those who think that the media is always wonderful, neither the BBC nor ITN dared to come to it. They were both too afraid of the government to attend to film it or even go anywhere near it. So we were the only camera crew there, and everybody was very, very welcoming. It's wonderful you're here. This is a very, very important event in Kenya's history, as indeed it turned out to be. And about 5 minutes in, there was only a very small crowd there, but a very big crowd around the outside waiting to see what was going to happen. The police opened fire on it, and several people were killed, and I ran for my life. And suddenly the crowd that had been so welcoming turned very, very nasty indeed. I'm not saying it's the same people, but it really was very, very unpleasant. That rioting went on for 5 days. It was a daily battle between the people and the police. And ever since then, the word stable has never passed my lips in connection with Kenya. It has always been a volcano waiting to explode. And again, on 27th of December last year, indeed it did. The seriousness of it, I don't think, can be underestimated. Kenya is a very, very important country in itself. I mean, a wonderful country. It also is a base for all the multinationals in East Africa. Nairobi is also the base for the United Nations operation, the whole of East Africa, and all the NGOs have their bases there. So it's very important internationally. But it's not just Kenya. The road from Mombasa to Nairobi and on carries all the goods from Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Northern Tanzania, South Sudan, and then quite a lot of other stuff going up into Somalia. If something really bad happens in Kenya, you're looking at a mega meltdown of a whole region. It really is, the seriousness of this situation cannot be underestimated. To discuss this, we have tonight Dr. Muzong Kodi, who is a associate fellow at Chatham House. He's actually Congolese, but he had taught at the University of Nairobi for 4 years, so he knows Nairobi and Kenya very well. Solomon Mugera, who is Kenyan and is head of the BBC Swahili service and was formerly a journalist in Kenya, and David Blair, who's the diplomatic editor of the Daily Telegraph, who was former Africa correspondent and frequently visited Kenya. So my impression in the first few days, or not my impression, but everybody else's impression, was that this must be a tribal conflict, which again was, I found quite it seemed an odd question to ask first. But can I ask, first of all, Solomon, I mean, is this just tribal Africa again?
Oh, well, yes and no. In fact, I might underline no, in the sense that the violence that erupted after the elections, it was a case of somebody feeling robbed of their victory and therefore venting that anger against that which they believe was party to stealing. So incidentally, then it happened that because people voted along tribal lines, So those who lost were in a certain tribal grouping, or a grouping of certain tribes, and those who won were also belonged also to a grouping of certain tribes. So therefore it assumed that tribal connotation. But it was a matter of a victor and the person who's lost, you know, venting their anger. It was not a tribe, say the Luos setting against the Kikuyus, or the Luyas setting against the Kambas or the Kisis. No, I think that's what we need to underline.
Yeah. Dr. Muzong.
The problem in Kenyan politics for decades has been that the political elites have manipulated ethnicity for their own good, to push to follow their own aims. And this is not a new phenomenon. You could see it in 1992 during the elections, in 1997 when Mr. Kibaki lost to Mr. Moi and threatened to take Mr. Moi to court, and along with him the Electoral Commission of Kenya. A number of people in the Mr. Moi's cabal at the time vented their anger by telling people in the Rift Valley that these are the Kikuyu again wanting to rob the election from Mr. Moi. And it ended up in a lot of killings, the kinds of killings that you're seeing now. So people used to live as good neighbors for years, all of a sudden were manipulated by politicians to vent their anger at each other, while the underlying problem in the area was really economic. Land grabbing by the elite had created a class of landless people in the region. So from this economic problem, there was anger among the people, but was manipulated along ethnic lines. And this has been the leitmotif in Kenyan politics for a long, long time.
David, you have ethnicity, you have poverty, land grab. Is there anything you want to add to these themes that might have sparked this?
I think there's a broader dimension. I agree entirely with what my colleagues on the panel have said, but the factors that they've highlighted are present in so many African elections. Kenya is merely the latest example, but the manipulation of ethnicity by unscrupulous politicians is more or less a constant factor in many countries. The most extreme example, of course, is Rwanda, but it happens elsewhere too. And I think what we have to address when we expect Africa to hold elections, when we expect Africa to introduce multi-party politics, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does that make it easier or more likely that unscrupulous politicians are going to behave in this way? Does this open another ground, as it were, another way of competition, which promotes the kind of ethnic turmoil which we've experienced in Kenya? I mean, in some ways, you have to ask yourself, are electoral contests, as they are fought in Africa, are they worth the price?
I'd like to just go back a little bit, because I'm old enough to remember what the one-party state was like in Kenya, and everybody assumed this was because it was a one-party state, that it was non-ethnic, that KANU was non-ethnic. But I'm going to ask Solomon to take us through, if you, I know it's complicated, but just to take you through from that time when KANU was the only party allowed, and it was for all Kenyans, and it was formed out of the original alliance of the Luo and Kikuyu and the Independence Now movement. And then the British at the time then started their own movement called KADU, the Kenyan African Democratic Union, to try and counter this weight of KANU and split Kenyans. And that was actually led by Daniel Arap Moi. And it was only at independence that when Kenyatta then tried to bring the nation together again by bringing Daniel Arap Moi in as vice president and then abolishing KADU, and KADU was merged into KANU. So this one-party state was called. But Solomon, can you just explain, I mean, is it possible to explain how we got from there and the first multi-party election in 1992
yes,
to where we are now. And is it describable in ethnic terms? Does that help us understand it or not?
Yeah, in fact, it's good you gave that historical background, because for those who might not understand the multi-party history in Kenya, Kenya was a multi-party state from independence. As he says, we had KANU, where you had Jomo Kenyatta and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. Kenyatta from the Kikuyu community, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga from the Luo community. And they formed this powerful party called KANU. But then, of course, as fate would have it, they parted their ways. But now, coming down to 1982, this was when Kenya began to move into a one-party state. And this was occasioned by the 1982 coup in Kenya. So then we had now politicians in parliament saying, let's drive the country towards a one-party state, and they did it. So come early 1990, there was agitation for reintroduction of multipartyism. If you remember names like Kenneth Matiba, Charles Rubia, and of course Jaramogi Oginga Odinga himself, that's when we saw now a rejuvenation of activism and people fighting for the reintroduction of multipartyism. President Moi, through both domestic and international pressure, yielded. And so in 1991, the Constitution was changed, and what was called the Section 2A of the Constitution was changed to usher in multipartyism. But again, he kept cautioning people that multipartyism will divide people along tribal lines, and parties were going to be formed along tribal lines. Maybe that prophecy came to pass, because we saw so many political parties being formed. If you remember, we had this huge umbrella organization called FORD, where you had people like Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, there was Masinde Muliro, there was Martin Shikuku. Kenneth Matiba was drafted in, but unfortunately for Kenneth Matiba, he was recovering here in London. When he came back, he didn't want to be part of that group. So Ford then split into Ford Asili, led by Kibaki, and Ford Kenya, led by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. Now that leaning again towards the Luos, and Matiba said leaning towards the Kikuyus. Mike Kibaki resigned from the government to form his own Democratic Party. Again, another heavy inclusion of the Kikuyus. So then parties began to teeter on those tribal lines to an extent that when people became fed up with political parties, people crossing all over the place, by the time we were going to elections in 2007, people were asking themselves, do we really need political parties? If at all today there's one party, tomorrow there's a coalition, tomorrow this small party has been bought by so-and-so, why do we need parties anyway? But I think later on, as we discuss this, we want to look at that in which Kenya is now. What are these 2 or 3 ingredients that have brought Kenya to where it is now?
What about corruption in all of this? Because one of the things that struck me over the years is the way when Moi had to fight that election, he then started this, the party started this Goldenberg Fund, which was a scam. I think initially something like $600 million was stolen, and then it sort of spun around the system and it grew into a pot. But it was a political fund of individuals, but it was a good fund. And then when Kibaki came in 2002, he promised that all this would end. And he set up an inquiry into it, a public inquiry, which was hugely popular. Kenyans turned out in their hundreds to line up just to get in to listen to this public. And they did find, who had done it, but nobody was prosecuted. And then they tried to find the money. And I think what happened, Kroll Estates were actually commissioned to find the money. They did indeed find it, but the next stage was to freeze it and return it. And they never got paid for finding it. And there never a second order, which was freeze it. And what had obviously happened was that the new government coming in, Kibaki's government, had made a few phone calls and to the people they now had found and knew where the money was, and said, okay, we'll split it with you, and just disappeared. I mean, this sort of corruption on this scale, which just passes from one government to the next, I mean, that seems to me to be the sort of thing that if you're living in somewhere like Kibera, must make you mad as hell. But you've worked for Transparency International, so you know a couple of things about this, don't you, Kodi? So,
The coalition that came into power in December 2002 came on an agenda of anti-corruption. And this raised a lot of hopes, not only in Kenya, but in other African countries, who were looking to see an example of a real fight against corruption. I myself at the time, as Richard said, I was regional director for Africa and the Middle East at Transparency International. And Transparency International at the time really believed that there was political will in Kenya to fight against corruption. So we helped the government in setting up a 100-day plan of action to fight corruption. A number of actions, very high-level actions had to be taken during those 100 days because the expectations were so high. A number of things had to be done and to be done very quickly. I myself traveled to Kenya in January 2003, and I will always remember that day when I saw John Githongo in the president's office. John had just left Transparency International to join the government as the senior advisor in charge of governance. So the question I asked John at the time, do you really believe in this thing? There are so many people in this new government who worked with Mr. Moy, and the song here is that the Moy regime was corrupt. But among the senior people you see in the new government are some of the senior people who were in the previous government, including the former Minister of Finance. He was, again, the senior minister. He had just left the Moy government in December 2002 to join the opposition because he knew which way the wind was blowing at the time. Mr. Raila Odinga himself, who was in Mr. Moy's government, left not because he was against corruption, but because he didn't get appointed to recount the election. Never did it while he was in government with Mr. Moy fight against corruption there or denounce it. So you found this mixture of people who had partaken in corruption. Mr. Mwai Kibaki himself, the president, was Minister of Finance under Mr. Moy for many, many years. How could you conduct these high-level corrupt activities without the Minister of Finance being in the loop? So I expressed my doubts to John. I said, really, this thing, I don't think is going to fly. But there was so much hope in the country. And John told me genuinely, Muzong, I believe in this. Because the president himself believes in this. We have to fight corruption. That's why he's brought me into his office. And even the physical location of his office was telling. He was just next to the president, which by any means made him very powerful. But then, my own suspicion of this fight against corruption was being just a slogan to gain votes during the campaign, obtained in a few months later. The 100 plan that had been discussed and put together by Transparency International was put by the side. And people continued. The corrupt networks that existed under Mr. Moy reorganized themselves and started just, they continued acting the way they had acted under Mr. Moy with impunity. So there's a continuity here. The same figures who had been part of all corrupt deals under Moy found themselves in the NARC government, and many of them are now in the opposition and are also now telling people that they want to fight against corruption. When I went back in 2004, I met a lot of the people from civil society and had discussions with them. We had within the government people who had been in the opposition and were championing the fight against corruption. People like Musikari Kombo, who was a member of the Pan-African Network of MPs against corruption. All these people had worked with civil society while they were in the opposition. When they got to power, they changed the telephone numbers. They were no longer contactable. And that first government was full of all kinds of scandals. They gave themselves some of the highest salaries and some of the highest benefits that you can find in any African country, and just forgot about the civil society organizations that we're working with, and the poor people in Kibera and other places were forgotten. So there's a continuity here of a culture of corruption that transcends political parties, because the same people move from one party to the next without changing any language. The parties are so similar in the makeup. Issues don't come up. It's personalities, it's ethnic groups that are discussed rather than ideas on how to develop Kenya or how to fight against poverty in the country. This may come in the discourse, but as slogans without having any depth of belief in what they actually want to do, what they want to carry out.
I'm going to make a cynical suggestion now, and the international community now, panicking slightly with this meltdown in Kenya, are basically saying, right, the only way that we're going to have peace is if all these corrupt politicians can get their snouts back in the trough and go on eating. Is that the best that we have internationally, so they go on eating and there will be peace in Kenya?
Well, in the short term, if your objective is to stop the killing, then it probably is. I mean, that's the brutal truth. For as long as the ODM are excluded from power, for as long as Odinga is able to claim that he's been unfairly robbed of his inheritance at the election, then the killing seems likely to continue. And of course, it's died away in our own newspapers and on our own television screens. 5 or 6 or 10 people are still dying every single day, and bodies are turning up every morning in Kibera. So a government of national unity in the short term probably is the only viable solution. But ultimately, I mean, as you say, it only reinforces this culture of patronage and corruption, and the idea that the only way in which you can be a politician in Kenya is snouting the Don Samuel to your... I mean, I think it's worth asking questions about the personalities involved, about President Kibaki in particular. We know he began with all these promises in 2002. We know he lamentably failed to deliver. What I'm not clear about in my own mind, but which perhaps my colleagues on the panel will be better qualified than me to consider, is, was he ever sincere? Did he ever actually want to do that? Was it elaborate all along? We know about Kibaki that he's 76 years old, that he tends to go to bed rather early, that he likes PG Roadhouse. But was he ever actually a man who, had he been given the chance, would have cleaned up the orgy stables of Kenyan politics?
Yeah, I think I might not get that phrase accurately, but the leadership we have, country can have, is a reflection of what kind of it is. And this brings me to 2 things that sort of describe the state in which Kenya finds itself in, not just now, but in the past nearly 40 years, Kenya has been independent. There is on the need harmony, that we need to live with each other as brothers and sisters. Fair enough. And Kenyans love that song, the international community love that song, church leaders and other religious leaders love that song, peace. And once we've spoken about peace until the cows go back home or the chicken go back to roost, then we forget some 2 big things which have come back to us as Kenyans. And I know there are Kenyans here who I would want them to assist me on this one. The 2 things we've been procrastinating about: truth and justice. We speak about peace, we don't want to speak about the truth, we don't want to speak about justice. Yet if you listen to the national anthem, the first stanza speaks about justice being a defender. Truth in what sense? Let me give two recent examples. In 1990 February, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Robert Ouko, went missing. Charred remains of his body found in a thicket in Western Kenya. The street bus, there was international pressure to know the truth, commission after commission, debate after debate in Parliament. To date, we know who murdered Robert Ouko. Has anybody ever been brought to justice? Is there any Kenyan here, my fellow Kenyans here?
We know
Judas.
he murdered him, but he was never convicted.
Yeah. Do we know who killed Robert Ouko? Nobody.
Well, we
Then,
but it was never.
no, we, of course, it was never established. We can only go by speculation and rumor, maybe. Now, just after that, a year after Robert Ouko went missing and his body has been found, the following year, that's when Golden Bag scandal erupts in Kenya. Kenya was supposed to be exporting gold. Gold, of course, whether it was illicitly or legally acquired from the DR Congo and other gold-producing countries. So a company was given a 35% compensation to export gold out of Kenya. That company was called Golden Bag International. It was discovered to be a huge scam in which millions of dollars were lost. I was in Parliament then. Kenya had just become multi-party. The first chairman of the Parliamentary Accounts Committee formed to investigate Golden Bag scandal was the late Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, the doyen of the opposition in Kenya. His committee didn't arrive at any verdict about Golden Bag, whether that money was stolen and who stole it and where it was. Unfortunately, he passed away. The mantle was taken over by a gentleman called Wamalwa Kijana as the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. He ran with the baton. He came back with a verdict which was strange. That, forget about those millions of dollars that were stolen. You actually need to pay that gentleman of the Golden Bag International more money. Are we getting the point about truth and justice here now? To death, then, okay, this thing, we came to something called the Justice Bosire Commission. Justice Bosire is a renowned judge. Respect to him. He chaired this commission, came with his findings, implicated one of the people in the current government. But again, has anybody ever been convicted of scandal? So has it ever been done in Kenya? No. We are going for peace. Truth unknown, justice postpone it. And then let's go to land. Land is at the center of some of these crises we're seeing in Kenya. Right from independence, the way land was allocated and distributed, how fairly was it done? People who still carry years and centuries or decades of bitterness because of being deprived of their land and hoping that one day they'll have justice. That has never been resolved. Instead, we keep on postponing. We heard a gentleman called Ndung who then chaired a commission to look into all these land issues. He came up with a report. It has never been implemented. That's why some here tribe clashes if the community says under community because they feel they've been deprived of their livelihood. We've never given them justice. We've never told them the truth, that this is your land and the government will protect you. And this is one of the weaknesses we've seen in the way, for example, we've dealt with have been affected violence, those who are violent places like Eldoret. Instead of the government providing security where they are, to drive this point home that, look here, as a Kenyan, it's a constitutional right to live anywhere in the country, and the government will give you protection as its sole and cardinal responsibility. Instead, we escort them, the government escorts them away from their land, away from their property to somewhere else. That then encourages the aggressors to take over that land. Now, those people who've been evicted, do you think they will live peacefully with themselves knowing that they were deprived of their land and property? They will seek revenge. So as we go about this, let's ask ourselves as Kenyans, why are we averse to this? The same question about the election in 2007. First, we're told the results are being cooked. Then the results are announced. Then the gentleman who announced the results says, oh no, come on, I'm sorry guys, I don't know who won this thing. So who will ever tell us the truth? And when will that justice ever come? As much as we call for peace.
Say to you is that 20 of Kibaki's ministers, many of them the worst in terms of corruption, were booted out by the electorate and replaced by total unknowns. They voted out Moi's sons. They voted out Biwat, who may have had something to do with the death of Mr. Uko. I remember it well. They voted. They know. It seems to me that the Kenyan people know exactly what's going on. They actually voted accordingly. And how then do we get all this violence as well? Because then, the people aren't it.
No, Kenyans aren't stupid. Number one thing, and this is the problem we have. Maybe if you put it down to leadership, what kind of leaders do we have? Do we as a country ever stop to think? Somebody wants to become a leader. What is the benchmark to becoming a leader in a country? Because as much as they booted about 20 former ministers in Kibaki's government, Kibaki has formed his government, and still when you look through it, there are people there who've got skeletons in their cupboards. Put the shoe on the other foot in the opposition. If Raila Odinga accepts to be called an opposition now, if he because he does, until know the truth, until justice is done, look at his team. Are there those in that team? Are there people there with the skeletons in their cupboard? So then a time will come when Kenyans are going to stop and say, you want to become a councillor, you want to become a member of parliament, you want to become a president, but do you remember the utterances you made via that vernacular radio station calling people from a certain community thieves, telling your own community to rise against them? Do you remember that? So if you can remember that, sorry, don't move closer to what? To leadership. Do you remember that we lost a foreign affairs minister? We've never known what happened to him, and you were implicated. These blood hands become a leader. Remember that you were involved in a huge financial scandal called Goldberg or Anglo-leasing, and because you thought forgotten, you were to come back leadership. Once we reach that stage, when we can have these checks and balances, when we can set a benchmark for our leaders, and forget about this tokenism of being told we're going to declare our wealth without even not knowing how you acquired that wealth and where it is, as a country still can deceive ourselves.
Thanks. Now, to open it up to the floor, who would like to ask our panel some questions? Yep, gentleman right at the back.
John Owen from Frontline Club. There's a story in the New York Times Herald Tribune today that challenges what you were saying about the spontaneity of the violence. Jeffrey Gettleman, reports today that there was good reason to believe that it was premeditated. Leaflets were found urging violence, that Council of Elders of the Kalenjin tribe were urging 2,000 assembled members of the tribe to go out and kill if the results went the wrong way. That a month before the election, a cache of weapons was found in the loot of a high-ranking minister of the government. He paints a picture, although he says lots of questions to be raised, about just how premeditated and how planned this violence was. What do you say to that?
Okay, thanks. And I'll take a couple more. Yeah, the lady right in the corner there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elsie, and I just wanted to ask, in this pursuit of truth and justice, don't you think that you might be opening a Pandora's box? Because many Kenyans are still not ready to hear the truth, and those Kenyans who speak the truth do end up suffering for it. And we've seen that with Wangari Maathai when she was campaigning for saving the forest, and we've seen that with Gilongo. So, what was just a
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. There's one at the front here.
Adam Roberts, a journalist. Very depressing long-term picture. For the short term, is there anything that outsiders can do to try to help resolve the situation in Kenya. I'm thinking particularly of other African countries or African institutions.
Okay. So was the violence premeditated? What can be done about it now? And are Kenyans ready for the truth? Who would like to start? David.
Just on the first point, I don't know if I misheard any of my colleagues, but I don't think any of us suggested that the violence was entirely spontaneous or it just suddenly erupted. I think the evidence presented in that article is very compelling and suggests a degree of pre-planning. And I think that illustrates the point that we've all made, that politicians manipulated these divisions and prepared to exploit them in the wake of the election result. So I think that reinforces what we said earlier.
Yeah, Mr. William Ruto, who's the MP for the area where we've seen the most violence, in his campaign speech, he used a very tribalistic kind of discourse. And it's not to many that the violence that erupted in the Rift Valley even started before the election results were announced. There's evidence that it started well before, and this would certainly tend to consist that organized and meditated. Outsiders certainly need to help Kenya. The mistrust between Mr. Raila Odinga's camp and that of Mr. Kibaki is very deep. Fallen out before. During the 2002 campaign, they signed a Memorandum of Understanding whereby, when they assume power, they would amend the Constitution to create the position of Prime Minister with executive powers that Mr. Odinga would assume. But that were introduced in the Constitution were not the ones that were agreed before. So the Memorandum of Understanding was not abided by. So with that in their minds, it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Raila Odinga's camp to go into a negotiation while they have this past of falling out with Mr. Kibaki when he didn't implement the agreement. So it's going to take a lot of work from outsiders, not to make decisions on behalf of the Kenyans, but to create an environment where dialogue would be possible, so that Kenyans can find solutions that they themselves agree on and can live with. The international community has a great role to play here, and especially the African institutions. But we know what they are. We know the record. They have been very ineffective in the past. It's very hard in the club of African presidents for one of the other. It would be interesting to see how the likes of Mr. Museveni will go try to tell Mr. Kibaki that the elections were fraud, while Mr. Museveni himself has never had any free and fair elections of any kind. So the international community at large, beyond the African institutions, have to do something. The African institutions alone have shown to be not to be very effective in this kind of situation before.
Solomon.
Yeah, I think maybe to pick up on the whether this violence was pre-planned, there is a degree of that, definitely. Before any major political event, you would expect people to go to whatever extreme to secure their own ground. But it's the scale of it which might vary. In this case, maybe the scale of the violence we are seeing, the scale of planning for this violence, while it was there, it didn't assume the level of, say, what you might call ethnic cleansing per se or genocide. It did not assume that scale. but it's that of people guarding fiefdom is an, and also in that filler out there that dare you deprive us of what belongs to us, then we can show you what we are made of. But I think what we have been trying to run away from is the use of the word ethnic cleansing or genocide. We head into, I don't think the country has teetered towards that margin. Truth and justice, whether it's going to reopen a Pandora's box, and I think a Pandora's box is already open. The can of worms has been opened. Whichever way you look at it, Kenya will never be the same again, because people are still going to look at the outcome of that election, not just to sort out, to settle the scores there, but also to dig back and say, hey, what happened to us many years ago? So the Pandora's box, to me, has already been opened. The problem with, as I say, procrastination. One major point running away hiding about is constitutional reform. Had we looked at that constitution, changed to suit temporary demands of our society, maybe we wouldn't have this kind of problems we are having. If we had looked at the Electoral Commission and said it should no longer be the prerogative of the president to appoint all the members of the commission, that he would consult other players of that particular election, maybe now we members who are nominated by the opposition who would say, look here, we are vouching for these results, or this is what went wrong. But you see, the law has never been changed, so the president still appoints the entire Electoral Commission. You look at what the Electoral Commission has done to Kenyans. The other problem that has arisen because of the Constitution is the judges who appoints judges. The only mandate Parliament has is to determine how many judges and the age they will retire. That's all Parliament can do. But now appointing those judges, who are they answerable to? And this is why the opposition does not want to go to the courts to seek redress, because they're afraid and they fear reasons demonstrated in the past that they can rule against the band. They can never rule against President Kibaki, knowing the fact that he's the one who appointed the Chief Justice, who we saw, he was swearing him at State House on the 30th of December. International pressure, just briefly. I think the international community got to the call and find out how did Kenyan governments respond to international pressure before. Yes, Moi balked under the pressure to introduce multipartism. But then remember, there was a donor freeze on President Moi's government. Did he survive to see his 10 years of rule or not? He survived. Even with those allegations of corruption, he survived. President Mwai Kibaki has finished his 5 years. He wasn't really a darling of the international community. He said something during the independence, if I may from that. And he reminded Kenyans this. He said, my government has achieved much, much more in the past 5 years we've been in government than the total number of been independent. And we have achieved this because of your money, taxpayers, and that strengthened our sovereignty as a government. In other words, he was telling the international community, you can try freezing aid on me, but I'm staying put. Are we getting the point here? So it all depends on what international pressure really means, and also how genuine that pressure is going to be. There's no point of Britain or America or whichever other country talking differently in public, but behind closed doors, they're whining and dancing. It's a Rosie Matilda thing. It's a salsa dance. Oh, congratulations. I mean, we're going to give you this, we'll do this. This thing is going to peter out. Give it time. It's a 21-day rule. The crowd will be over, and it's business as usual.
In my experience, they pretend it's the other way around. They make nice noises in public, but they say, but we're giving them a really hard time behind the scenes, and you just wonder whether they are actually saying anything at all. Anyway, let's have some more questions. Yes, over here in the corner.
No, we've heard quite a lot about.
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, actually, a former colleague of yours from the IU and now with Aureus Advisors. We've heard quite a lot about the absence of multi-party politics until recently in Kenya. and that's a useful context. Obviously, in the context of political repression, it's almost an accepted phenomenon that African elections provide a sort of hiatus in which people can take to the streets, depending on the country, and vote there. Do you not, there's another dynamic in addition to the ethnic one which you're talking about, and it is certainly a tinderbox in Kenya which can be lit at any time, which is just years of underinvestment and a socio-economic dynamic, which is essentially an angry youth. And what this seems to be about, to a greater extent to me perhaps, than ethnic rivalry and ethnic tensions, are simply very, very angry and young men who don't well at the best, that are expressing years of frustration at a time when it's almost acceptable to do so because it's an election. And therefore the urgency, as well as the ethnic situation in the judiciary and so on, seems to me to be to do something about that as much as some of the processes by which Kenya might move forward institutionally.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, is it 44% are under 17 in Kenya? It's huge. It has one of the highest population growth rates in the world. Yes.
Hello, my name is Susan from University. I just want to say something going to your point. You say the situation you explained a few minutes ago is something regular in African context. So what I'm saying about the problem of Kenya, I'm still asking myself, how can this problem be addressed in a way to give a peaceful solution? Because I don't think even the Kebaki or Odinga are any one of them the best solution for the country, because no one of them up to today have been addressing the problem of the civil society. Also, another thing is, I think the media need to work, and institutions need to work more in the way people are. Because you criticize the international one, the international society about a kind of propaganda of peace since independence, live together, me and you, blah, 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 like that. Okay, what do you think? In the society that you got different tribes, and a lot of African constitution, the best thing probably is put it all together, try to read all that kind of society, all that kind of, I need to have a kind of relation with them. Then neighbors need to rest in some way, need to look a solution for it. That's have never been done, I don't think, by any African government. If we don't start doing things like that, they will never work. We still have of the growth when some politicians want to get into government.
Okay, thanks. And yes, at the back there, yeah?
My name is Julius. I'm a journalist from Kenya as well. There is a factor in the history of this conflict, maybe perhaps our speakers haven't captured. And if you go back to the conflict between Jaramogi and Kenyatta, which ended up making Kenyatta never to step in Kisumu until he died, and also ended up kind of bringing Jaramogi, the father, into political oblivion until 1978 when he died. And therefore, when we come from that time, we see the new continuation of the same happening from Raila the son with the Moist regime, which detained him almost 7 times. Now, if you were to pit the conflict between Luos and Kikuyus, as the Western media is doing at the moment, would that be a factor? But again, I'm not going to focus on that very much because we're talking about Kenya, which is about 42 different tribes. Now, how does that all spill over? We spoke about justice and peace and truth as well. Now, as a Kenyan, I know the difference because I was in the media when I was in Kenya, and it was very difficult environment to operate during Moist regime. But our problems as a country, and it's my observation as being pit, you can just go to the constitution and you find all the problems there. I'll give you an example. Just in 1991, 3 sections of the constitution were amended. One was Chiefs Act, the other one was Public Security Act. Now, and then the Section 2A, which made Kenya a one-party state. If you go back to the Chiefs Act, it was drafted in the constitution during colonial era. Now, when you look at that section, people couldn't come together. So it was breaching the freedom of assembly effectively. Public Security Act was again used so many times to disperse meetings from the opposition leaders, to kind of disallow gathering of people. And when you come to Section 2A, which was enacted in the Constitution in 1982, it totally made Kenya a one-party state. That meant any other party was outlawed. You couldn't form another parties, like the equivalent of coming to Britain and saying only conservatives are allowed legally to be the sole political vehicle. Problem arises when you go to Kenya, like any African country, you have all political parties being vehicles to people to enrich themselves, and therefore it becomes a very big bone of contention. Now, how do we help Kenya to first and foremost come up with structures that can be trusted across the board? We go to the Constitution of Kenya, it's got to be changed, it's got to be amended. Without that, we can't get anywhere, because in every society, wherever you go, is regulated by a proper regulatory framework, whether it's the constitution of a country or any other legal framework that can keep the country continuity.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take one more, just, from here.
Thank you, Richard. Deropiudas, Royal Carmel Society. Just very quickly, we witnessed another stolen election last year in Nigeria. I was wondering if there was any lessons learned from that, especially by the international community. 2, why does the West keep insisting on coalitions? They never worked in the West. And 3, would the panel like to comment on the Chinese media's assertion that the entire democratic process is flawed in the African continent and that we should resort to traditional leadership models? Thank you.
Quite a few questions there. Is it youth? Is it ethnicity? The constitutional thing, and 3 from Dev on other Chinese right. Is democracy a waste of time in Africa? And the Nigerian election, and I've lost the last one. Coalitions, yeah. Who would like to pick up on some of those?
Angry youth, that's for sure. When you look at the statistics, the economic statistics of Kenya for the last few years, last year and the year before, the economy grew at more than 6%, which is pretty high. But then when you look how this really translates in the well-being of the people in Kenya, it doesn't show really. A lot of the youth are unemployed. People are getting poorer by the day. So it's no wonder that a lot of the youth are venting their anger when the opportunity has been offered to them after these elections. I'll pick the Chinese. The Chinese would say that, wouldn't they? That democracy is a waste of time. They forget that Africa is in the 21st century. And when you talk about traditional leadership, the word tradition, what's your baseline? Is it 1940, or is it before the Europeans arrived on the African soil? Is it the 16th century? It's as if African countries have not evolved over the years. Africans are living in a globalized world. They're living in political entities that are completely different from the ones that they knew during the pre-colonial days. So going back to the traditional chiefs is not an option, really. The Constitution needs to be relooked again. Not only the Constitution, people are talking about having elections, the presidential elections again. But before we get to that, if we really want to solve some of the immediate problems, the Electoral Commission has, the rules and regulations have to be revisited. If it was possible for people to cheat at the tallying phase, there must be loopholes in the rules and regulations that need to be looked at. Changing the constitution alone will not solve all of the problems. People need to be also educated about their own rights. People have to be made aware that they have the right to hold their own leadership to account for their actions. And when you look at it, a lot of the problems some of the leaders get into are related to the kinds of pressures that they're put under by their own people. Transparency International Kenya in 2003 tried to go beyond just anecdotes and measure the kind of pressure that MPs are under. And this was done with a number of MPs. But the first results showed that the constituencies of those MPs were requesting in monetary terms amounts that were equal to 15, 20, and even 30 times what they actually earned. And for people to be re-elected in the constituencies, they have to deliver. But they can't deliver with their own salaries. So what do? When a vote comes to Parliament and brown envelopes are passed around, certainly people will be tempted to grab them. So it's also civic education that should be prioritized to make people understand that the kinds of pressures that they put on the leaders also lead them to some activities that they would like to support.
Okay. Solomon?
Yes, civic education is important and can only be carried out particularly if you've got a vibrant media and civil society. A vibrant media would say Kenya's media has really evolved. And some of you who've been to Kenya would attest to this, that they're vibrant, they're bold, and adventurous. The only blip, I think, to me has been the advent of vernacular radio stations, which are used as vehicles to perpetuate or convey hate messages. Civil societies that with them in 2002, when we had a coalition of political party forces and people wanting to consign Moi's legacy into the history books, they coalesced. Civil society joined with the politicians and the opposition, and they formed this thing they called the National Rainbow Coalition. And then they went to Parliament only for us to realize, actually, we had deprived the country of a vibrant civil society. They all had gone to Parliament, and some of them had been appointed into government. And the kind of staunch civil society embers you used to see lighting up in Kenya almost flickered away. You talked about coalitions. And I just wanted to give you a taste of what President Kibaki said in 2002 December when he was taking the oath of office. And he said in his speech, the National Rainbow Coalition represents the future of Kenya politics. NAC, that's the National Rainbow Coalition, is the hope of this country. Our phenomenal success in so short a time is proof that working in unity, we can move Kenya forward. And then he went poetic. Look around you. You see a gorgeous constellation of stars we are. Just look at this dazzling mosaic of people of various ethnic backgrounds, race, go on and go and so forth. And then he ended up with something saying, we chose to forego our individual differences and personal ambitions in order to save this nation. Some prophets of doom have predicted a vicious infighting in following this victory. Prophets of doom had predicted a what? A vicious infighting in this coalition. Were they prophets of doom anymore?
No.
They just come to pass. By the time we were going to the elections 2007, NAC was dead and buried. The constellation of stars had been deemed and banned out. So coalitions, there you go. Yes, we're told it's the only way out, people sharing power, people sharing responsibilities, but until that is engraved in our constitution, it counts for nothing. And this is why people are talking about forming a government of national unity between Raila Odinga and Mwai Kibaki. Before you look at the constitution to secure that, to guarantee and protect that kind of understanding and the roles and power they share, it is simply, they simply crumble in the shortest time possible, and we'll be back to not even square one, but into the abyss. Because at the moment, there's so much power in the executive, and that's where the bone of contention is. How do you share this power? How much of this power should the president surrender to another position, maybe prime minister's position? How much of that? Now, this is one question Kenyan politicians, particularly when they get into power, they don't want to tackle. Traditional leadership, as China is, could be advocating, hey, once a chief, always a what? If you're tired and you die, you pass it on to your son or your brother. That is dynasty, political dynasty. So is that what the Chinese want us to do?
I made one comment about the Chinese. It's reported, I can't give you the exact quote, but somebody said that one senior Chinese official, having been around Africa and had witnessed an African election, was overheard to say that if members of the Communist Party in China tried to campaign in Mercedes wearing Savile Row suits and Rolex watches, the party would be out of power tomorrow. David.
Can I stress that we've identified, all of us, two glimmers of hope. One is the Kenyan media, which is genuinely free today in a way that it wasn't 10 or 20 years ago. And that's of enormous importance. It's important on two levels. First of all, in terms of deterring corruption, you simply can't do it unless you have a free media able and willing to expose it. And secondly, in terms of having a proper election, it's impossible to have unless you have a free media. So Kenya is moving in that respect. And the second glimmer of the parliamentary election. We kind of forget that there were two elections on the 27th of December. Rather bizarrely, one was flawed, but the other went off quite well, and Kenyans voted the right way, and a whole raft of crooks lost their seats from the vice president downwards. So I think following on from that, when it comes to the question of what the outside world can or should do, I think we should move on from this debate over the merits of whether we should insist on a coalition or not. And make one very specific point, which is that the best thing that could happen for Kenya now would be the election to be rerun in a way that's transparent and is above board, and that must be the starting point for resolving the political crisis.
Do you think it's doable in the sort of, with the sort of temperature that's running at the moment?
Well, in the end, anything is doable if the will is there. In the end, it can be done, and in the end, the pressure can be brought to bear if we want to bring it to bear.
Can I just ask, you mentioned the hate language being used on some of the vernacular radio stations. Is anybody monitoring this and recording it and putting it on a website? I mean, I've heard those stories as well, but I've never actually seen the quote. This radio station in whatever, you know, Kalenjin or whatever is saying this. Is there somebody documenting this?
Yes, even the government, the Minister of Information has been monitoring this. It's aware about what's being transmitted on each radio station in that country. There have been complaints about certain messages and the deliberate misquoting of certain individuals. For example, when Raila Odinga was condemning the torture in people, if you remember the story, we had 200 people who sought refuge in that church, and it was torched. More than 30 died or were burned to death. And one of the radio stations, broadcasting vernacular, said he had accused whoever did that as thieves. They branded a particular community as thieves. But when you look at what he actually said, there was no use of the word thieves. So that again, temptation to either twist things around to achieve a certain end result. And I think Kenya might want to borrow a leaf from Tanzania. Tanzania, they just don't license vernacular radio stations. Tanzania has got more ethnic groups or tribes than Kenya, more than 100, but they enjoy a certain level of harmony that we can only sit back and admire with our 42 tribes.
No one's picked up on Nigeria. so I will. I covered the Nigerian elections, and I don't think I've ever seen such anger in all my life. It was quite extraordinary. And there were village after village in the north where, there had been no election, the ballot box had been stolen, the thugs had moved in and beaten up anybody who tried to vote. I got shot at on one polling station where I was with a friend who was standing, and he was trying to vote, and somebody took a pot shot at us. I mean, it was just unbelievable, and it was stolen. There was no election really outside Lagos and Abuja and Kano, and those cities went to the opposition anyway. I mean, it was really very, very strange, and it's all been quiet since. I think either Nigerians are extremely patient, which we all know they are not, or they don't believe in democracy, or that too will explode shortly when they finally get round to expressing their anger at that stolen election, and then everybody will say, oh, what a surprise, we thought Nigeria was stable. Some more questions. I think this will have to be the last round. Yeah, Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Cockett. I'm another journalist. I've got two quick questions. First of all, it looks as though now Kibaki and his henchmen are going to try and tough this out, not make any concessions, have no coalition, no rerun election or anything. What would you advise the opposition to do now in a practical way? How do you bring pressure on the government in a practical way to change its mind? What are the pressure points in your view? And the second related one, it's been very busy into the community, the non-African international community, probably quite rightly, but they do have a range of mechanisms, if you like, at their fingertips, sanctions, withdrawing of America, for instance, $1 billion worth of weapons aid to Kenya, military deals, etc. These are all things that could be brought to bear. Would you advise the international community, as some European politicians do very quickly, a full range of travel sanctions, economic embargoes, etc.? Or would that, in fact, play into Kibaki's hands, as his ministers have been arguing on the Kenyan media?
Okay. Another one? Yeah, at the back there.
Raymond Graham, I'm just sort of private citizen.
That's fine.
I've got sort of questions about three areas. My first one is under elites. Is there, I'm sort of listening to what you've been saying, it seems as if it's kind of around the table of a single sort of elite body. And is there any sort of hope or any mechanisms whereby this elite would be refreshed, or kind of a new team or new type of people coming up to take over? A second, just sort of on the same heading of elites, is it seems a little bit that politics of the elite is somehow disconnected to the politics of the people, or am I wrong? In the sense, it just seems the same names that sort of dance on different sides of the table and so on like this, and how, with you having great knowledge, how does it connect downwards? My second question is more about the neighbouring, you talk about international community, but I read an article a couple of weeks in FTH, I think, saying how Kenya, especially through Mombasa, is a very critical transport link to different countries. And what's actually happening on the ground with regard to places like Uganda, which is landlocked, Rwanda and so on like that, which have roots. And, well, just frankly, how long will we stand for it? And it's kind of saying, I'm from Tanzania, so I'm kind of saying, well, here's a hope for Dar es Salaam to steal a march, but you don't be at ports at night. So, people with power, people in the ground who've got real businesses in Africa, in neighbouring countries, aren't just going to sit around. What sort of traction is going on there? My final point was, well, I suppose it's very good actually. I was going to say military, but with a very small m, very, very quietly, which is unlike places like, I don't know, Pakistan or other sort of trouble spots. How can we never hear anything of Kenyan military or not? So somebody could maybe tell me something on the history of that. Just thanks.
Yeah, and just behind you.
Hi, Carly Fry, I'm a graduate student at the LSE. Just a couple points for those unfamiliar with the Kenyan parliamentary system. What is the significance of the recently elected Speaker of the House? And And secondly, what are the possibilities of voting for confidence?
Okay. I think can we just have that point of what is the power of the Kenyan Parliament and the power of the Speaker? Who would like to take up that? Solomon, can you?
Yeah.
There's a simple factual question we can get out of the way.
Oh yeah, exactly, we can do that, yeah. Parliament, as you know, that's where laws are made. But over the years, what you've seen is Parliament belittling, demeaning its own authority to an extent that even when you've got crucial motions or bills in the House, there is a relentless or a series of lack of quorum in that Parliament. And I think the first step this 10th Parliament should do is to reassert the authority of Parliament by playing by their own rules and raising to the occasion as men and women of integrity. Only then can they be taken seriously. If not, we go back to the late 80s when one editor of a government-owned newspaper at that time decided to do a kind of register, a sort of a roll call of which member of Parliament attended which session and for how long, and which member of Parliament had not attended Parliament in how many days. It was a kind of way of monitoring the attendance. Maybe we might go back to those days in order to hold these guys accountable.
Are they not going because it just has no power, so they don't bother, or they've been bribed, or they've got better things to do?
The thing is, the only thing you need to do is go to Parliament, bow before the Speaker, go and say hi to a buddy sitting there, or nowadays if you're with your mobile phone, send a little text messages, stand up again, bow, thank you Mr. Speaker, sir, go have your tea and some snacks. You've already signed in. The day is gone, your sitting allowance well secured, whistle all the way to the bank. Now, is that the kind of Parliament we can have in the 21st century? Speaker is a very crucial role. In 1993, when Moi's election was also disputed, there was a possibility of moving a vote of no confidence. But because there was a Speaker who really understood standing orders and how to manipulate the opposition, that did not happen. In 1997, Mwai Kibaki himself also sponsored a motion of no confidence in President Moi's election in government. Again, the government teamed up, of course, with Raila Odinga's party, NDP that time. They defeated that motion. Now, this time round, if ODM sticks together as a party and maybe drawing 4 to 6 other members of Parliament, and they decide to move a vote of no confidence in the government, there's a likelihood they could win. Because the Constitution, and I think that Section 49 talks about moving a vote of confidence, it needs a simple majority, it does not need a 2/3, if I'm right on that one.
But the difficulty of the vote of no confidence in the Kenyan Constitution is that if the vote of no confidence passes, it's not only the president and the government that go, it's also Parliament.
So they lose their allowances.
They lose their allowances, and they go to elections again.
Okay. All right. Let's pick up on some of the issues. Kenyan military. What do we know about them?
You go ahead. The Kenyan military. Whether the Kenyan military or having a coup will be an option, I don't think it's something on the lips and minds of Kenyans at this moment now. Since 1982, I think Kenyans have learned a lesson, and I think the Kenyan military has demonstrated a degree of professionalism. And you see, it's a military consisting of people with feelings, people from tribes. There are Luos in the military, there are Kalenjins in the military, there are Kikuyus in that military, Kambas and Luyas, name it. Each one of them, when they tune in, when they see on television, they can see their own areas being hit by this violence. Maybe they have seen their own brothers, sisters and mothers being victims of this violence. But I think there's been a great degree of restraint. And at the moment, the country is hoping that there can be a political solution to this than a military, because if you bring in a military solution, what next? I think when installing nobody wants to be installed in by a military. That would be a tainted precedence already. So I don't think I would really bank so much on the military. Political solution, I believe, will be the way forward.
Okay. The elite renewing itself, with a possibility of that? Does anybody, or is corruption too deep now? What do you think?
Bringing in new blood, in the short to medium term, I think it's going to be very difficult because you have a very entrenched political elite which have set themselves in a kind of club, very close club. I don't see that happening in the short to medium term.
Okay. Well, I think...
Could we take some of the others?
Yes, sorry, yes, pick up.
On the international community, I think that question was addressed to you. The international community could bring a lot of pressure to bear. I personally think that outside Africa, the main partners of Kenya can make a difference if they work in tandem. Just 2 or 3 days after Mr. Kibaki was sworn in, the European Union gave Kenya 83 million euros. And last week I saw Mr. Louis Michel and asked him why they did that. Is that an endorsement of the new government, the elections? He said no, but that was approved a long time ago, so we had no choice but to release the money now. So the international community can do something, but if they work in tandem, not the kind of things that the European Union has just done, which gives the wrong message that we've accepted the results of the elections as they are. It's a vote of confidence in Mr. Kibaki, and that's sends the wrong message, I think.
I think the key mistake has been a lack of coherence. Some governments, notably the Americans, gave the impression that they'd actually accepted the election result. Other governments, like our own, said there should be a coalition, but when war wasn't formed, they didn't say anything at all. I think if there were a united message from the European Union and America saying 3 things: 1, we don't recognize the present government; 2, there should in the short term be a coalition; and 3, there must then be a rerun of the election under proper supervision. If the EU and America delivered those 3 messages and did it loud and clear and backed it with the well-known pressure points that we all know exist, then I think that could have an impact.
My worry is we have an example in Zimbabwe. The suffering continues. Each one of us here has seen, and you can analyze the situation on your own. You are Zimbabwean. International pressure. Maybe you might say, would it really bring the government in Kenya to bear, to yield?
They don't care about it at all. They're not interested in the fact that the rest of the world doesn't agree with what they're doing.
Yeah. Would you like to repeat that? Because I think people at the bank didn't hear. So did it have any effect on Zimbabwe?
No, it has absolutely no effect whatsoever. It's a complete, as you say, corruption at the top, and they're not interested, and nobody's going to get in there. He's killing many, many people in opposition parties, and the international people are just not looking at what he's doing. And he continues to do what he wants. And the people of Zimbabwe are, well, we know, it's a meltdown right now. And they are really, really suffering.
And also, many questions keep on being asked. Do we still have bilateral relations between Zimbabwe and London? Do we still have bilateral relations between Zimbabwe and Washington? Do we still have multinational companies doing businesses and therefore making profit in Zimbabwe?
Yes, we do. Okay, I think really we've got to. It's 9 o'clock, and we promised to finish by then. But I hope everybody will go down to the bar and continue this conversation and stay close to this story, because I think there is a possible tragedy of great magnitude here, and I hope that we won't let the British government off the hook on this one and try and just cover it with nice words and do nothing. I really think that we've all got to keep watching it very closely and demand more news about it, find out about what's going on, and do what we can to make sure this tragedy doesn't come about. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks to our panel.